Late 1980s. Arizona desert light. Somewhere in the dry heat, a photograph was taken. Two girls standing close together, their hair sun-bleached, their faces bright, with the kind of laughter that only exists before life becomes complicated. One of them is looking straight at the camera, the other isn't. She's looking at her sister. That second girl is Annie Guthrie. For decades, the world has known the name Savannah Guthrie. Millions of Americans have watched her sit behind the Today Show desk each morning, interviewing presidents, guiding viewers through elections, crises, and national conversations with the steady calm that morning television demands. To the public, Savannah became something familiar, reliable, almost permanent. The kind of presence people welcome into their homes before their first cup of coffee. But Annie always knew there was another story. Not a scandal, not a shocking secret waiting to explode. Something quieter than that. According to Annie, the real story of Savannah Guthrie isn't about fame at all. It's about the cost of building a life under studio lights, and what happens to a person when strength slowly becomes the only version of themselves they allow the world to see. Because Savannah didn't just build a career. Over time, she built a version of herself composed, disciplined, endlessly capable. The woman millions trusted each morning. But Annie says that for years, that public version of Savannah was almost the only one anyone ever saw. So what finally made Annie decide to speak? And who is Savannah Guthrie? When the broadcast ends, the cameras power down, and the studio lights go dark. Before we go further, I'm curious. If you grew up watching morning television in America, do you remember when you first noticed Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show? Tell me in the comments. Savannah Clark Guthrie was born in 1971, in a family that, by most accounts, looked ordinary from the outside. 3 children, a busy household. Life unfolding under the wide skies of Arizona. But families are rarely defined by what the outside world sees. People who knew the Guthrie family during those early years often described it as close-knit. The kind of family where siblings spent long afternoons together, where loyalty formed quietly through shared routines and private jokes. Savannah and her younger sister Annie were especially close. Even in childhood, their personalities balanced each other in subtle ways. Savannah was driven, curious, always leaning forward into whatever came next. Annie, by contrast, tended to observe more. She listened. She noticed details others might miss. And perhaps most importantly, she understood her sister. That understanding would become important later. Because when Savannah was still a teenager, something happened that changed the emotional landscape of the entire family. Their father, Charles Guthrie, died suddenly after a heart attack. For any young person, the loss of a parent is a rupture. The world rearranges itself overnight. According to people who knew the family, Savannah responded in a way that would later feel strangely familiar to those who watched her career unfold. She didn't collapse in public. Instead, she became intensely disciplined. In later reflections, Annie suggested that something inside Savannah seemed to shift during that period. It wasn't coldness. It was something quieter than that, a decision, almost invisible at the time. Savannah seemed to conclude that the safest way to move through the world was to be capable, unmistakably capable. The kind of person who could hold things together when everything else felt uncertain. And once she made that decision, she rarely walked it back. The family moved several times during those years, which meant Savannah repeatedly found herself entering new schools and new social circles. Experiences like that tend to sharpen certain skills. Savannah learned to read people quickly. She learned how to adapt to unfamiliar rooms. And perhaps most importantly, she learned how to keep her own emotions carefully managed while doing it. Years later, those same instincts would become part of what made her so effective on television. After graduating from the University of Arizona, Savannah continued her education at Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C. At that point in her life, journalism wasn't even part of the plan. She was studying to become a lawyer. And for a time, that's exactly what she did. Savannah practiced law and passed the bar, building a career that looked stable and respectable on paper. But somewhere along the way, another opportunity appeared, one that would redirect the entire trajectory of her life. She moved from the courtroom into journalism, initially working as a legal analyst and reporter. The transition might have looked surprising from the outside, but to people who knew her, it made sense. Savannah had always had a particular talent for explaining complicated situations clearly, for translating tension, conflict, and nuance into language people could understand. And television needed exactly that skill. Once the camera entered the picture, the story began to accelerate. But Annie would later suggest that something else began changing during this period too. Because as Savannah's professional life started gaining momentum, there was also something quieter that she slowly began giving up. And almost no one noticed it happening at the time. Savannah's entry into journalism did not begin with celebrity. It began quietly, in the careful world of legal analysis. After practicing law, she moved into television as a legal correspondent, explaining court cases and legal disputes for news audiences. At first, the work stayed close to what she already knew: the language of law, the procedures of the courtroom, the structure of complex arguments. But television demanded something different. A lawyer speaks to judges and juries. A broadcaster speaks to millions of people who may know nothing about the law at all. Colleagues who worked with Savannah during those early years often noted a particular ability she had. She could take complicated legal conflicts, dense, technical, sometimes confusing, and translate them into language that felt clear, even human. It wasn't just information, it was explanation. And television rewards people who can do that well. Still, the transition from law to journalism was far from easy. It meant starting again in an industry where experience mattered more than credentials. Savannah had to learn the craft from the beginning: how to report quickly, how to write for broadcast, how to speak naturally while millions of viewers were watching, and perhaps most importantly, how to prove she belonged there at all. The American television news industry is famously competitive. Hundreds of reporters move through local stations and smaller markets every year, hoping that eventually one of the major networks will notice them. Only a few do. Savannah's persistence gradually opened those doors. She joined NBC News, first working in Washington, D.C., covering national politics and legal stories. Her reporting often placed her close to the center of government, including assignments involving the White House and major federal cases. The pace was relentless. Morning briefings, late-night preparation, travel, deadlines, live segments that allowed little room for mistakes. Some colleagues later recalled that the schedule could consume nearly every hour of the day. Careers grew, but personal lives often shrank. Savannah rarely complained about that pressure publicly. Instead, people who worked alongside her described someone who simply kept moving forward, assignment after assignment, broadcast after broadcast. Years passed that way. Gradually, her role within NBC grew larger. Then came the moment that changed everything. Savannah Guthrie was named co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most powerful positions in American morning television. For decades, the program had been part of the daily routine for millions of viewers across the country. To sit at that desk was more than a promotion. It meant becoming part of the national conversation every single morning. For audiences watching from their kitchens and living rooms, it looked like the peak of a remarkable career. The Arizona girl who had studied law shifted into journalism and climbed step by step through one of the most competitive industries in media, had reached the top. But Annie, watching from the outside, saw something else beginning to happen. Because the moment Savannah finally arrived at the place so many journalists dream about was also the moment when the pressures surrounding her life quietly became far more complicated. Morning television is not just a job. For the people who live inside it, it becomes a way of organizing your entire life around a few hours of live broadcast. The alarm rings long before sunrise, around 3:30 inches the morning, while most of the country is still asleep. Coffee, notes, makeup under bright studio lights, producers reviewing scripts, last-minute edits to the rundown. And then, suddenly, it's live. Millions of televisions switch on across the country, and the day begins. For Savannah Guthrie, this routine became the rhythm of her life. Every weekday morning, she sat behind the Today Show desk, helping guide viewers through the news of the moment, political debates, national tragedies, celebrations, cultural shifts, the quiet stories that filled the space between them. Over time, Savannah became more than a broadcaster. She became a familiar presence in American homes. Viewers watched her interview presidents, speak with world leaders, and moderate difficult conversations during some of the most politically charged moments in recent history. But just as often, she was there for the smaller rituals of morning television, lighter interviews, conversations about family life, moments of humor that balanced the seriousness of the news. For many viewers, Savannah represented something steady, someone calm when the world felt chaotic, someone composed when headlines were not. But fame, even the quiet kind that grows through morning television, always reshapes the private parts of a person's life. During those same years, Savannah's life outside the studio was also evolving. She married Michael Feldman, a political and communications consultant. Soon afterward, they welcomed their 2 children, Vale and Charlie. Motherhood became one of the most important parts of Savannah's identity. Friends have said that despite the demanding schedule of national television, she was deeply devoted to her family. Photos from those years often show her laughing with her children, holding them close during rare, quiet moments away from the cameras. To many observers, it seemed like Savannah had achieved something rare, a life where professional success and personal happiness existed side by side. But Annie would later suggest that the reality was more complicated than it appeared. Because behind the calm, steady version of Savannah that viewers saw each morning, there was a habit she had developed over many years. A habit that almost no one noticed. She held her emotions inside. Not dramatically, not in a way that created headlines, just quietly. The discipline that had helped her build a remarkable career, the ability to remain composed, controlled, and capable under pressure, had slowly become something deeper. Almost a rule she lived by. And then, in 2017, something happened inside the NBC newsroom that would test that rule in a way Savannah had never experienced before. It was the kind of moment no broadcast professional ever fully prepares for. And when it arrived, Savannah would have only minutes to face it live, on national television. In November 2017, something happened inside the NBC newsroom that few people in television had ever experienced in quite that way. Matt Lauer, Savannah Guthrie's longtime co-anchor on the Today Show, was suddenly fired after allegations of sexual misconduct surfaced inside the network. The decision came quickly, and within hours, millions of viewers across the country would be turning on their televisions, expecting the normal morning broadcast. Savannah was told the news only minutes before the show began. Then she had to walk onto the set and announce it, live. For years, she had shared that desk with Matt Lauer. They had worked side by side through elections, interviews, and thousands of hours of television. Whatever the complicated reality of that professional relationship was behind the scenes, the moment itself was deeply personal. Yet the structure of morning television doesn't pause for personal moments. Savannah had to deliver the news calmly. She had to acknowledge the shock. She had to speak with empathy for viewers who were hearing it for the first time. And then, the show had to continue. Many people watching that morning noticed the emotion in her voice, the visible effort it took to stay composed. But television viewers saw only the part that happened on camera. What they didn't see was what it meant to process something like that while the entire country was watching. Later reflections from people close to Savannah suggested how unusual that situation truly was. She had to experience the emotional impact of the moment At the same time, she was responsible for explaining it to millions of people. Grief, confusion, professionalism, all happening simultaneously. And that moment was only the beginning of a series of years that would test her resilience even further. A few years later, the world changed again. The pandemic forced television networks, like much of the country, to improvise overnight. Studios closed temporarily. Broadcast routines shifted. Anchors who had spent their careers inside controlled studio environments suddenly found themselves broadcasting from home. Savannah did exactly that. She anchored segments from inside her house, while the same rooms around her became classrooms for her children, Vale and Charlie, who were navigating remote school like millions of other families. At the same time, the country was facing a national crisis. Daily death tolls, political tension, uncertainty about the future. Morning television still had to appear calm, and Savannah was still expected to help hold that calm together. Then another challenge arrived, this time physical. Savannah suffered a retinal detachment, a serious eye condition that caused significant vision loss in one eye. For most people, it would have been frightening enough. But for a television anchor, the implications were even more profound. Reading teleprompters, focusing on cameras, maintaining visual awareness during live broadcasts, all of it suddenly became more complicated. It was the kind of diagnosis that could easily have forced someone to step away from the desk. But Savannah didn't step away. She continued working. And according to Annie, that period was when something inside her sister slowly began to shift. For much of her life, Savannah had operated under a simple rule: be strong, hold things together, don't let the cracks show. It had worked. It had built a remarkable career. But Annie began to sense that Savannah was starting to question that rule in a deeper way than before. Because there was one truth that had quietly followed her through all those years of success. Savannah had always known how to take care of other people. She knew how to hold space during interviews, how to guide conversations through difficult moments, how to show empathy to guests, viewers, colleagues. But for a long time, according to Annie, she didn't quite know how to let other people take care of her. When you hear that part of her story, what surprised you the most about Savannah Guthrie? Tell me in the comments. Because after all those years of discipline, success, and resilience, something unexpected began to happen. Not a scandal, not a sudden revelation, just a slow shift in how Savannah began to see her own life. For many years, Savannah Guthrie rarely spoke publicly about the role faith played in her life. Viewers knew her as a journalist, sharp, composed, focused on facts. Morning television rewards clarity and professionalism, and Savannah built her reputation on both. But somewhere beneath the public identity of the anchor, faith had always been present in quieter ways. In more recent years, that part of her life began to appear more openly in interviews and conversations. Savannah has spoken about how her Christian faith helped her keep perspective during some of the most demanding periods of her career. Not as a dramatic turning point, and not as something she used to define her public image, but as a steady reference point when everything around her felt uncertain. Faith, she suggested in conversations over time, helped remind her that the anchor desk, no matter how visible, was not the center of her life. That shift in perspective gradually affected other parts of her world as well. According to Annie, the changes didn't happen overnight. They unfolded slowly, in small decisions that might not have seemed dramatic to anyone watching from the outside. Savannah began saying no more often, not to the responsibilities she cared deeply about, but to the endless additional requests that often come with success. Extra appearances, additional commitments, opportunities that once might have felt impossible to turn down. Instead, she began protecting certain parts of her time. Time with her husband, Michael Feldman. Time with her children, Vale and Charlie. Time that didn't belong to television schedules or newsroom demands. For someone who had spent much of her life proving how capable she could be, the simple act of stepping back occasionally became its own quiet transformation. Rest, in other words, stopped feeling like a weakness. But the most important shift, Annie believes, happened in a more personal place. For years, Savannah had been extraordinarily skilled at presenting the version of herself the world expected to see. The calm broadcaster, the thoughtful interviewer, the woman who could guide millions of viewers through complicated news cycles without losing composure. That version of Savannah was real. But it wasn't the only version. Gradually, Annie began noticing something new in their private conversations. Savannah seemed more willing to let people see the parts of herself that had long remained carefully protected. Not the professional identity, the human one. The mother who worried about her children, the sister who still remembered their childhood in Arizona, the woman who, despite a career built around confidence, sometimes had doubts like anyone else. For Annie, this shift didn't feel surprising. In many ways, she had always known that version of her sister existed beneath the public image. She had seen it long before cameras entered Savannah's life, long before millions of viewers associated her face with the beginning of their mornings. What changed, Annie believes, is that Savannah finally began allowing that fuller version of herself to exist more openly. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the balance of her life began to look different than it had before. And that, in Annie's view, is the part of Savannah's story that rarely makes it into headlines. Because Savannah Guthrie's journey isn't only about the rise of a successful broadcaster, it's also about something quieter, the challenge of building an extraordinary career and then learning how to live inside it without losing the parts of yourself that existed long before the success arrived. The anchor desk may have made Savannah famous, but the most important parts of her life were always happening away from it, which is why, in many ways, the story returns to where it began, back to Arizona, back to that photograph taken years ago under the desert sun. Two sisters standing side by side, one looking at the camera, and the other looking at her. Because sometimes the person who understands your story best is the one who was there before anyone else started watching. There's still that photograph, Arizona sunlight, two sisters standing side by side. One girl looks straight into the camera, confident, curious, almost as if she already knows the world is watching. The other girl isn't looking at the camera at all. She's looking at her sister. Annie has said that image stayed with her over the years. Not because it was special at the time, but because of what it represents now. In that moment, long before television studios or national audiences, Savannah Guthrie was simply a girl laughing in the desert sun. Not an anchor, not a public figure, not the steady voice millions would later wake up to every morning. Just Savannah. Today, of course, the world sees something very different. Each morning, millions of viewers still turn on their televisions and find her sitting behind the Today Show desk, composed, thoughtful, guiding conversations the way she has for years. But Annie believes something subtle has changed. The woman people see now is still the skilled broadcaster they trust. The professional who built a remarkable career through discipline and resilience. Only now, there's a little more space for something else, too. The sister, the mother, the person who existed long before the cameras arrived. And maybe that's the quiet truth Annie wanted people to understand all along. If you've watched Savannah Guthrie for years, leave a like as a small tribute to her journey.